Hi everybody. Let's debrief some patterns that you want to be familiar with when working with strings. So this illustrates one pattern. If I want to write a method that will reverse the input string, the algorithm idea is I want to loop backwards over the string, and I want to add each letter one at a time to an output which returns at the end. So before you code, you always want to understand the algorithm idea. So let's sort of imagine how that works just to make sure it makes sense for us. If the string I'm trying to reverse is hello, I'm going to loop backwards over the string. So I'm going to start with the last letter and loop the opposite direction. That's what this for loop must be about. This must be about I'm going to get letters out one at a time. So I'm going to get the letter O out of the string, and then I'm going to add it, I'm going to append it to the end of this output string here. So out starts out as nothing. But as I'm looping backwards, I'm going to get the O, and I'm going to add it to the end here. So now it looks like this. And then as I continue to loop backwards, I'll get to L. I'll get the letter L out, put that at the end. Then I'll keep looping backwards. I'll get the next L, get that letter out, put it at the end. And hopefully you can see that I'm in the process of spelling hello backwards. If I'm looping backwards and adding one letter at a time to the end of this string, I'll get O-L-L-E-H. So that's the algorithm idea. Let's think it through in actual code. So if you're going to use this pattern, you've got to actually initialize a string, initialize it to empty string here. We talked in class about this being very inefficient, but we're not going to worry about that right now. You want to return it at the end. How do you loop backwards over a string? So it might be tempting to say str.length here, but that doesn't quite work. Well, I guess we could make it work here, but here's my thought. Let's think about HELLO again. So here's the indices. I want I to point directly to the index of the letter I'm trying to get. So I want I to start at 4 and then go to 3, 2, 1, and 0. So when I get a letter out, I'm going to get the letter starting at index I, ending at I plus 1. So if I were 4, I'd be going from 4 to 5. Notice that that doesn't actually go out of bounds because I don't actually access the index at I plus 1. So even though 5 would be out of bounds, I don't get this letter. So this is perfectly fine. All right, if I'm going to start at index 4, I can't say string.length. Because notice the string.length here is 5. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters. So I'm going to start at length minus 1. This is a very, very common pattern. You just have to remember it. It's easy to be off by 1. And I want my I values to go all the way down to 0, including 0, because I do really want to get this 0 letter. Great, so that's the pattern. Let's try and apply that same idea to a practice problem. We're going to define swap, where we want to swap adjacent pairs of letters. So A, B, C, D, E, F, the A and the B swap, the C and the D swap, the E and the F swap. If you have an odd length string, then it just won't do anything with that final letter. Before we try and code, let's just make sure we understand the algorithm idea. So the pattern I want to be using is I want to loop over the string somehow, get letters out of it, and then add letters to an output string in the way that I want them to. So if I'm looping over here, I think instead of looping from the end, which made sense when I was reversing it, I think I want to loop from the beginning. So I'm going to be looping forward this direction. But what I want to do is I want to get out letters maybe 2 at a time, so that way I can add them in the opposite order. So I'm thinking I could start here. I could get the letter at I and get the letter at I plus 1. But then I would add them to the output string in reverse order. Then I'd skip I by 2. And then I'd get out the next 2 letters, and I'd add them in the reverse order. And then I'd skip by 2, and I'd add them in the reverse order. So in my mind, that's the kind of pseudocode. So I goes from 0 to the end of the string, and we add by 2s. I get out the first letter at I, and then I'll get out the second letter at I, and then I'll have the output to the end of the output, I'll add the second letter followed by the first letter, because that's going to add them in opposite order, in reverse order. And then at the end, I'll return. So this is kind of pseudocode. This is just me writing down my general idea. Let's type it up. So let's program by intention. I'm going to pretend that the method I'm writing already exists. So it's called swap, and I'm going to give it a sample string here. I'll let IntelliJ automatically create the method for me. I'll create swap. I want it to return a string, and I'll call this str as input. So following the pattern, I'm going to declare an output string that's the empty string. I'm going to loop all the way through this string. I'm going to type it sort of without thinking too hard, and then we'll come back and fix the errors. So I want it to start at the beginning, go to the end. Remember, we want it to skip by 2s because we're going to get letters out 2 at a time. So I'm going to get out the first letter, which is going to be string.substring from I to I+1. And then I'm going to get the second letter, which is going to be substring from I+1 to I+2. And then I'm going to add those to the end of output, but in the opposite order. And then here I'm going to return out. Okay, let's run it and see what happens. All right, so what's happened is it says string index out of bounds exception. So that means that I've tried to access an index that doesn't exist in the string. So let's think about why that is. Let's go back to the paper. Okay, so for the code that I just ran, the input string was A, B, C, D, F. There was no E, so this is nothing there. So why did it go out of bounds? Let's try and trace it. So I started at 0, and I get the letter from I to I+1, and then I get the letter from I+1 to I+2. So I get out the A and B, and that's just fine. Then I add 2 to I, so now I is here, and I do the same thing. Then I add 2 to I, and now I is pointed here. Let's think about all the indexes. This is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So index 4 is the last index, and right now I equals 4. So if I get the substring from 4 to 5, that works just fine. That'll give me F. But then my second letter, I'm trying to get the substring, from I+1 to I+2. So if I is 4, I'm trying to get the substring from index 5 to index 6. Because if this string had an even length, there would be one more thing here to get. And so it would be fine for me to get starting at 5 going to 6. But because it's an odd length, there is no last character here, and so that's what's going out of bounds. So I think what I need to do is I need to treat odd length strings separately. There's a lot of ways you could choose to do this. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an if statement here. Well, let's do this actually. So rather than getting the 2 letters out and then adding them to output, I'm going to change the ordering here. So I'm just going to directly add the second letter to output, and then I'm going to directly add the first letter to output. So this does the same thing it used to do. It's just a little bit shorter in a different order. So add, I'll say append second letter, and append first letter. Okay, why was this helpful? The reason this is helpful is because now I can put an if statement that says if string.length, so I only want to append the second letter if I isn't the last character. Because if I is the last character in the string, there is no second letter. So I'll say only if I is less than string.length -1. Why did I say -1? This is the index of the last character. And so again, let's like go back and visualize it. If I is pointed at the last index, then that if statement will be true, and so I won't try and add that second character because one doesn't exist. If it's an even length string, then I would never point at the last character. It would always be one before the last character, so it should still work. There are other ways you could choose to handle it. You could have stopped the loop early and then had a separate if statement at the end that just adds the last character if the string were odd length. That works also. But let's go ahead and run this one, because I think this is a fine way to do it. Okay, so now we are getting the reversed letters the way that we wanted. Let's just test with an even length string and verify that that one works as well. Great, so that one seems to work also. Pattern 2 is looping over a string, getting out letters, and then checking to see if they're something that we're searching for. And if they are, then we'll add to a counter. So there's one major problem here, and I was just pointing at it. You can't use double equals to compare strings, because this compares the two memory references to see whether these two are pointed at the exact same string object. That's not what we want to say. We want to say, do those two strings contain the same value? So to do that, we'd say let dot equals letter. So you got to use the dot equals to compare values. Okay, if we're trying to count how many times this letter occurs in the string, we're assuming letter is a single letter long. We're going to loop over the string from the beginning to the end. We're going to get out one letter at a time using substring. We check to see if that's the letter we're looking for, and if it is, we add to the counter. All right, so how are we going to practice that? Let's try and modify it so that instead of finding one letter at a time, I'm searching for a particular 3-letter sequence. So let's sketch out an example first for the algorithm idea. So here is my idea for how you could apply the same approach here. We still want to visit every single index in the string. It's just that we're not going to get one letter at a time. We're going to get 3 letters starting at that index. So first we'll check the first 3 letters, and we'll say, is that XXX? The answer is no. So then we'll move on to the next index, and we'll check the next 3 and say, are those 3 XXX? And the answer is no. And then we'll check the next 3, and the answer is no. But then, eventually, we're going to hit an index that is the start of what we're looking for. And so if we get 3 letters in a row starting at that index, it will equal XXX, and then we can increment a counter. So let's try and implement that algorithm idea. Programming by intention again. Let's S out. I forget what I called the method. I'm going to call it this, though. So let's do ABC, or like ABC, XXX, DEF. And let's do one more. All right, let's create the method. I'm going to return an int because it's a count. I'm going to call this string. I'll declare a counter to start. I'll loop all the way to the end of the string. And again, we'll think about, this is going to break it, but we'll think about why in a minute. If I was getting one letter at a time, I would say string.substring from I to I plus 1. But I don't want to get one letter at a time. I want to get 3 letters at a time. So I want to visit index I. That's the first letter. I plus 1 is the second letter. I plus 2 would be the third letter, but I actually want to get that letter. And I plus 3 would be one index past the third letter. So that's going to give me 3 letters, starting at I plus 0 and plus 1 and plus 2. So instead of calling it letter, I'll call it check, as like something to check. And I'll say if check equals XXX, then I'll increment the counter. And we'll return the counter at the end. Okay, let's run it and watch what happens. Here, I'm going to comment this one out. You might be able to guess what happens. It's very similar to what happened last time. Okay, again, I got string index out of bounds exception. So that means I tried to access an index that didn't exist. Again, let's think about why. So if this is the string I'm looking at, my indices go all the way to the end of the string. I'm going all the way up to string.length. So imagine what happens, imagine what happens when I is pointed at that last index. I'm going to get a substring starting at I, which is just fine, but then I'm going to try and get the letter after that and the letter after that. So it's going to try and get X plus the next 2 characters after X, but there aren't any characters there, and so that's why it's going out of bounds. So here's my favorite way to fix this problem. what's supposed to happen in here, this is like an if statement for should we keep looping. So if we're getting one letter out at a time, I want to say keep looping as long as the index isn't out of bounds. As long as the index is less than the length of the string, which is like one index past the edge here. So I want to think about what's the largest index I'm ever going to access. Remember, I don't actually access I plus 3, but I do access I plus 2. So in order to be safe, I know that I plus 2 has to be less than the end of the string. So the general concept is figure out what's the most extreme index you're going to access, and then have a statement that makes sure that that index is still in bounds. And that'll guarantee that you're safe. This is maybe a little bit unconventional. I think a lot of people, like imagine this is algebra class. If I subtract 2 from both sides of this inequality, I would get this. And a lot of people write it that way. I has to be less than 2 indexes before the end of the string. And so you can also think about it that way. But for me, I think it's clearer for me to think about the index I want to access. Let's make sure that thing is in bounds. All right, let's do the last pattern. So the last pattern uses index of to locate a particular special character, and then substring to extract part of the string related to that character. So let's imagine an email address. In an email address, we know that there's exactly one @ symbol. So if I want to extract everything that happens before the end of the email address, I'll use index of to search for the @ symbol, and that's going to be located at a particular index. And then I'm going to get the substring starting from the beginning of the string, going all the way up to the @ symbol, but not including the @ symbol. And so that's going to give me the name, and I'll return it. So that's the idea of how it works. Now let's imagine applying that idea to reformat a name that looks like a first name and then a space and then a last name. And I want to reformat it so that I get the last name and then display a comma and then a space and then the first name. So in other words, I need to take this and I need to break it into 2 parts, a first name and a last name. If we were using .split, this would be really easy. We just split on space. But let's do it without split. Let's do it just using index of and substring. All right, so whoops, let's do reformat David Dobrovich. Let's create this method. It's going to return a string, and here's the input string. So I think we're guaranteed that there's exactly one space in this string. So here's my solution strategy. Let's find the space. Then let's get out the substring up to the space, and let's get out the substring that happens after the space. And then we can put them together in a new ordering. So we'll say first name. Well, let's get the index first. So space is located at string.index of space. And now I can have first name be string substring starting at 0 going up to where the space is, but it doesn't include the space. Last name is going to be a substring. I don't want to start at space because I don't want the space to be part of my last name. So I want to take where the space happens and then add 1 because that's actually the beginning of the real last name. And then I want to go all the way to the end of the string. So I don't need to say string.length here. I can use the version of substring where I just tell it where to start and then it goes all the way to the end by itself. All right, so now that I've got the first name and the last name, I want to return a new string that looks like the last name followed by a comma and a space and then the first name. Okay, let's run it. And there we go. It seems to have done the thing it was supposed to do. All right, so you want to really practice thinking in terms of these patterns. Think about when do you need a loop, how should you be looping, when should you use index of and substring, do you need to adjust the bounds of your loop so that you don't go out of bounds? These are the kinds of things that you want to be practicing. Give the individual practice problems a try if you haven't already, and I hope that this was helpful.